The grand ballroom at the Sheraton in downtown Fort Worth was packed rows of folding chairs behind velvet ropes. Media tripods clustered at the back. It felt less like an education policy summit and more like a campaign rally in disguise. There was a certain charge in the air. That familiar tension that brews when people pretend they've come for serious dialogue. But really, they're just here to watch someone get embarrassed on live TV. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sat near the end of the panel table, spine straight, legs crossed, listening with quiet intensity. She wore a deep teal blazer, a legal pad open in front of her blanc, so far. A pen resting neatly at the corner. Beside her were 3 other members of Congress, a school superintendent from San Antonio, and 2 national education consultants. At the podium stood Vice President JD Vance, halfway through his keynote address. The American flag loomed large behind him. Cameras from C-SPAN and 3 Texas affiliates lined the back wall. Vance was polished, confident, grinning, the kind of smile you wear when you know the room leans your way. He circled back again and again to the same phrase, ideological bias in classrooms. Then he paused, and we're fortunate to have Representative Jasmine Crockett with us today, he said, turning slightly toward her. She's been vocal about what she calls systemic discrimination in public school curricula. But I have to ask, are we talking about real, measurable harm, or just political theater? The audience stirred. Vance stepped aside from the podium now, voice sharpening. I respect your service, Representative, he said. But how does assigning To Kill a Mockingbird or teaching about the Founding Fathers become, what did you call it, a weapon of oppression? That line wasn't on the official program. It was a quote lifted from an off-the-cuff remark Crockett had made in a heated committee hearing a year earlier. Stripped of context, it sounded inflammatory. Crockett looked up. A flicker passed through her eyes, not fear, not surprise. Recognition she'd been baited. The crowd leaned in. That tight, anticipatory silence when people want to see if someone's about to be knocked off balance. She clicked her pen, cleared her throat. Thank you for the question, Mr. Vice President, she said, her voice even. First, let me be clear. I'm not against teaching To Kill a Mockingbird. I read it myself in high school. She paused, letting the calm settle. But when schools tell only one kind of story and ignore how today's policies still shape outcomes for Black and brown students, it's no longer just literature. It becomes silence. And silence, Mr. Vice President, can be a kind of harm too. A few quiet murmurs from the audience. Some heads nodded, but Vance pressed on, stepping down from the podium as though he were building a courtroom moment. But isn't the real issue underperformance, not underrepresentation? He said. Maybe instead of obsessing over curriculum representation, we should be talking about math scores and parental involvement. Jasmine paused. Then she opened her pad and scribbled something short. I grew up in Dallas ISD, she said. I remember sitting in a science lab that didn't have a single working microscope, not one. Meanwhile, 15 minutes north, kids were dissecting frogs with brand new equipment. She turned to Vance. So yes, Mr. Vice President, we'll talk about math scores. But we're also going to talk about why some students never even get the same starting line. A wave of applause rolled from the back. Some scattered clapping near the front. Vance tilted his head, half smirking. But isn't that a local problem, not a federal one? He asked. At some point, don't we have to stop blaming the system and start asking what personal responsibility looks like? Now, the silence got heavier. Not hostile, just cautious. The kind of silence where people are afraid to be caught reacting the wrong way on camera. Jasmine didn't move. For a moment, she was still calculating. Her fingers curled around the edge of her legal pad. She drew breath to speak, but a quiet voice from the back cut through first. Excuse me? It wasn't loud, but it rang through the ballroom like a clear bell, calm, measured. Certain heads turned. A tall, older man stood in the last row, gray at the temples. Tan linen suit, no press badge, no campaign pin. A navy satchel over one shoulder, a stack of manila folders under his arm. There was a pause, then whispers. A name passed between seats like static. That was Dr. Kenneth Baylor. Some knew him from academia, former dean at the University of Houston. Law Center, expert in constitutional law and education policy. Others remembered his searing op-eds and surgical public takedowns of political doublespeak. Baylor didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. When he spoke, people listened. Vance looked thrown off for the first time. A flicker of unease touched his expression. He glanced toward the moderators. But they didn't stop the man. Dr. Baylor adjusted his satchel, then spoke again. Steady and firm. If I may, I believe I can clarify a few things about Representative Crockett's experience. I was the one who recommended her for a federal civil rights externship when she was still my student. Dr. Baylor said calmly. A soft murmur passed through the crowd. Jasmine slowly turned, eyes wide-eyed in shock, but something closer to reverence. It had been nearly a decade since she'd last seen him in person. She didn't ask me to speak, he continued, stepping toward the front. But sometimes, when half a story is used to discredit someone, the other half deserves to be told to balance the scales. Now facing the audience, he took a breath. I remember Jasmine Crockett as a third-year law student in my advanced constitutional law seminar. Right, persistent, and unafraid to challenge assumptions. The kind of student who made the whole class sharper. He glanced toward the panel. One afternoon, we discussed San Antonio ISD v. Rodriguez. She stayed after class for over an hour, pressing me on how that ruling failed low-income school districts, especially black ones here in Texas. Vance crossed his arms, his expression darkening, but Baylor pressed on. The next week, she brought me a proposal. She wanted to lead a student-run research team to analyze how school boards were applying discipline policies unevenly along racial lines. We didn't have a program like that. She created one. A woman in the front row, likely a local principal, whispered something to her assistant and began taking notes. Baylor opened his folder and held up a printed document. This is a 47-page report, Crockett wrote. It examined 3 Texas school districts, mapped racial disparities in discipline, and proposed corrective policy. That was 11 years ago. She was 27. Silence swept the room. I bring this up because the conversation we're having today, it's not new to her. She didn't start caring about education equity after she got elected. She was doing this work when she was living in a one-bedroom apartment near 59th and Kirby, still paying off student loans. He gently placed the folder on the table in front of Crockett and turned to Vance. Mr. Vice President, you questioned her qualifications. You questioned whether she understands the system. I'm here to say she's lived it, and she's studied it harder than most. A cough from the media row sounded suspiciously like a stifled laugh. Crockett stared at it. The folder, but didn't touch it. Her fingers hovered just above it. Okay. Baylor gave a final look around the room. That's all, he said softly, and returned to his seat like he'd just returned a library book. Vance wasn't about to let someone else have the last word. He straightened, his face composed but tight. You could almost hear the gears grinding behind his eyes, man used to controlling the conversation, suddenly upstaged by quiet authority. He adjusted the mic. Dr. Baylor, he said, with a forced smile, I appreciate your input. But with all due respect, we're here to discuss policy solutions, not personal resumes. There it was. Dismissal by redirection. But this time, it didn't land. Heads turned not toward Vance, but back to Crockett, not as a viral firebrand from committee clips, but as someone whose credentials had just been laid bare. Validated, Vance pressed on, trying to regain control. Let's remember why. We're here, he said. Education outcomes are falling. Parents are losing trust in the system. We fix that by getting back to basics, writing, arithmetic, not ideology. Crockett finally spoke. Her voice was calm but firmer. Now, with all due respect, Mr. Vice President, she said, the basics aren't the same for everyone. She sat forward slightly, eyes locked. You keep saying ideology like it's a dirty word. But the truth is, what gets taught and what gets erased as political? Ask any teacher who's had to skip a civil rights lesson because it made one parent uncomfortable. Vance shook his head. I'm not talking about censorship, but that's exactly what we're talking about, she countered. You brought up parental trust. Maybe that trust breaks down when students of color come home asking why slavery was mentioned like a passing event without ever connecting it to today's housing policies, generational wealth gaps, and underfunded schools. A beat passed. Baylor sat silently, listening. Then a woman in the third row stood up. Her badge read AISDO Stone Independent School District. May I speak? She asked. The moderator hesitated, then gave a nod. I've taught 8th grade social studies for 22 years, she said, and Representative Crockett is right. I've had to email parents before I even start lessons on redlining or Brown v. Board just to avoid complaints. I spend more time defending facts than teaching them. Applause broke out, sustained and genuine. Vance's smile thinned. The moderator stepped in, trying to steer the event back to its schedule. We'll now continue with the next question from our panel. But the tone had shifted. What had started as a one-sided attempt to discredit a congresswoman had quietly transformed into something else entirely, a public reckoning. Crockett leaned in, her voice low but unmistakably clear. You tried to use this stage to make me look small, she said. And it was obvious to everyone in the room. He failed. She held Vance's gaze, voice steady. I've been doing this work long before I had a title, she said. And people like Dr. Baylor who mentored me, challenged me, and stood with me when no one else would dart the reason I'm still standing. Then she turned not to Vance, but to the crowd. If we want to fix education, we have to stop treating history like the enemy. The truth doesn't need to be feared. It needs to be taught. Applause erupted again, louder this time. Someone from a local station held their phone up. A live stream was already rolling. Comments sipped down the screen. She's schooling the VP live. This is the energy we need in Congress. Who is Dr. Baylor? I need more of him. Vance remained still. He hadn't technically lost the argument. He still had influence, airtime, the weight of his title. But in that moment, the crowd wasn't with him, and that mattered. He cleared his throat and leaned into the mic. We'll have to agree to disagree. It fell flat, but for Jasmine Crockett, this wasn't the end of a debate. It was the beginning of something bigger. Dr. Baylor stayed seated for the rest of the panel, his eyes calmly tracking the conversation. Even when the moderator moved to a safe, pre-approved question about federal after-school grants, the energy had shifted. The room wasn't really listening anymore, not fully. They were watching Jasmine, watching her posture, her restraint, not to see if she'd snap, but to see what she'd do next. When the panel wrapped and the cameras shut off, the room filled with a low hum. Journalists whispered. Attendees lingered instead of filing out. Jasmine stood slowly, gathering her notes. Before she could leave, a young staffer leaned in and whispered, "You're trending." She nodded, but didn't smile, not yet. Dr. Baylor rose too. And as if by silent agreement, they met halfway down the center aisle. "I wasn't expecting you," she said. His voice was warm, but precise. "I figured you weren't. I almost didn't come." She raised an eyebrow. "But you did. I knew where this was going the second Vance said your name. I've seen that play before." You deserve better. Jasmine sighed. It's always the same dance. They don't debate the issue. They debate who deserves to speak. Exactly, Baylor nodded. That's the playbook. They stood quietly, reporters pretending not to eavesdrop. That folder. She said finally, glancing at the report he'd brought. I haven't seen that project in years. I keep a copy of every student project that changes something. He said, yours made me rewrite 2 lectures. That doesn't happen often. She laughed lightly. I was so stubborn back then. You still are, he said, smiling. But now you're stubborn with power. She paused. Her voice turned more serious. Do you think it mattered what I said today? Baylor looked her in the eye. There was a girl in that room, 13, maybe 14, sitting with her mom by the sound booth. When you spoke, she stopped fidgeting. She leaned forward. You weren't just talking. You were fighting for her. Jasmine blinked slowly. Sometimes. We don't know who we're reaching, she said. But they're always watching. They stood in silence a moment longer until his tone dropped even lower. Remember that student from your externship? The boy from El Paso. Carlos, she nodded. They tried to expel him for walking out during the pledge. You defended. Him, no legal team, no budget. Half the paperwork missing, and you still won. That's when I realized, she said quietly, it was never about one kid. It's always the system. He tapped the folder still in her hand. That system never expected someone like you to come back holding a mic. Just then, more staffers approached. A senator waved from across the room. Security moved to clear a path, but something lingered in the air. Just respect. Not just pride. Clarity. Everyone knew they'd just witnessed. Something that hadn't been scripted, but would be remembered. Jasmine looked at Baylor one last time. You stopped me from saying something I'd regret. He chuckled. I know. I've just reminded them who you've always been. This time, she smiled, genuine, unguarded. And just before the crowd swept her away, he leaned in and whispered, don't stop telling the truth, even when they try to shrink you. Especially. Then, the summit was over. But the moment wasn't. The internet hadn't even warmed up yet when it started. Clips from the summit began quietly circulating on social media. It began with a single 37-second video posted by a local political reporter, who'd kept her phone rolling after the live stream ended. In it, Dr. Baylor stood calmly in the aisle, telling the story of a young law student who challenged how discipline was applied to students of color. At first, it barely cracked 200 views. But by midnight, hashtags were snowballing. Hashtag had Sir, hashtag Dr. Baylor. Hashtag Crockett was right, hashtag truth of the summit. Then came the clip that changed everything. Jasmine's final line, you tried to make me look small. But I've been doing this work long before I had a title. That clip hit 1 million views before sunrise. By the time the morning political roundups aired, the exchange wasn't just viral, it had crossed into mainstream news. The media, as always, did what it does. Some called it a clapback. Others called it poise under fire. But most headlines missed what the comments already understood. Jasmine hadn't just stood her ground. She didn't stand alone. At 7 a.m., the Philadelphia Ledger ran a profile on Dr. Baylor. By noon, an old C-SPAN clip resurfaced 2003. Baylor testifying before Congress on racial disparities in school funding. Long before Crockett ever ran. For office, he'd been doing the work too. Then came the emails. A retired superintendent from Ohio. I worked with Crockett before she was elected. She helped us rewrite a discipline code that had been targeting black girls for years. It wasn't flashy work, but it changed lives. A mother from South Dallas, my daughter was being bullied and blamed for it. Jasmine showed up at the school board meeting when no one else would. We never forgot. The stories poured in quiet, powerful, specific. They painted a fuller picture. This wasn't about a viral moment. This was a legacy. Meanwhile, inside the White House, Vice President Vance's comms team was in full scramble. Their original plan: clip the summit and spin it to conservative. Networks, another example of identity politics gone too far. Instead, they were accused of trying to ambush a sitting member of Congress, one with a visible trail of community work behind her. Vance said nothing publicly, but behind the scenes, his office quietly requested the full summit transcript. Damage control had begun. Back in Fort Worth, Jasmine Crockett sat in her dim hotel room, phone silenced, screens off, notepad open. Thoughts scribbled, rewritten. She'd been through online storms before, but this one felt different. Not like survival, like something opening. A knock, her chief of staff. "Sorry to interrupt. You've got 3 interviews tomorrow in PR. 2 local radio stations and a school board in Amarillo wants to know if you'll speak next month." Jasmine looked up. About curriculum. The staffer shook their head. About courage, she blinked. "I didn't do anything special." A pause, then quietly. "That's what makes it powerful." The door clicked shut. Jasmine stared at the ceiling. She thought about Dr. Baylor, his timing, his calm. She thought about the girl near the sound booth, the one who had leaned in, eyes wide, when Jasmine spoke. She thought about every moment she'd almost quit when it felt like her words vanished the second she stopped talking. When no one heard her unless she raised her voice. But this time, something had broken through. And it wasn't just her voice. It was who echoed it. Still, not all applause comes without backlash. By the next afternoon, clips from the summit had hit daytime talk shows and cable panels. Everyone had a take. Some praised her poise. Others accused her of orchestrating the moment, suggesting Baylor's presence had been staged, though no evidence supported it. For every spin piece, dozens of real stories pushed back. A high school teacher in Lubbock posted about being reprimanded for teaching Reconstruction honestly. A charter school administrator from Yuma shared an old email Crockett had followed up on a student complaint across state lines. Each story chipped away at the narrative Vance's camp was building. This wasn't theory. This wasn't branding. These were receipts. And Jasmine had them. But every rise casts a shadow. That evening, conservative influencers pounced. A cropped clip of Jasmine's comments on curriculum was being pushed as anti-American. Stripped of context and fed into the outrage machine. The battle was far from over. But this time, the record wasn't just a speech. It was her record. People were finally paying attention. The clip was stripped of context and blasted online with an all-caps caption. "This is who's shaping your child's education." By nightfall, trolls flooded her mentions. Her office phone lines lit up, some messages angry, others chillingly explicit. The staff had to set filters just to find the real constituent emails buried beneath the noise. One stood out, no name, just a single line from a Tennessee area code. "Sit down before we put you down." Casey, her communications director, printed it out and laid it on her desk. Jasmine read it once. Then again, no flinch, just a flicker. In her eyes, "Are we reporting this?" "Already did," Casey replied. "FBI liaisons on it." A long pause. "Can I ask something?" Casey said. Jasmine nodded. "Did you know Dr. Baylor would be there?" She shook her head. "Didn't even know he was still in Fort Worth." Casey exhaled. "I figured, but people are asking. Some think it was planned. They just want to shut it down. Then tell them the truth," Jasmine said. "We don't choreograph honesty." Outside, thunder rolled low and slow. Storm clouds pressed down on the city, heavy and unmoving. Later, Jasmine stepped out for air, hoodie up, head low. Even in flats, she moved like someone used to being watched, but not rattled by it. She stopped at a gas station on 7th Street for water. Behind the counter, a man in his 30s wearing a maintenance uniform looked up. "You're that?" "Congresswoman," he said. She paused, then nodded. He rang her up in silence. But as she turned to leave, he added quietly, "My daughter's in 9th grade. Said she saw your clip in civics class today." Jasmine turned. "She said you made her feel like she belonged," he said. "She's never said that about a politician." Jasmine blinked, emotion catching her off guard. "Thank you," she said, meaning it more than he'd ever know. Back at the hotel, her staff had her next day laid out 3 interviews, a school visit, and a possible invite to a national education panel. She scanned the list, red pen in hand, then circled. One line, Community Q&A, Arlington High School, 6 p.m. That's where the real work lived. Not in headlines, not in hashtags, in rooms with people. But not everyone wanted her in those rooms. The attack shifted from loud to surgical quick, targeted, and harder to trace. By day 2 post-summit, a smear blog appeared accusing Jasmine of plagiarizing her law school equity report. The evidence? A half-page section that had been properly cited, reviewed, and approved by Dr. Baylor himself over a decade ago. Next came the YouTube experts dissecting her body language. She rehearsed this, one claimed. Watch her smirk. She wanted to be attacked. Through it all, Jasmine said nothing. No counterclips, no hashtags, no slick explicable videos. She chose presence over performance. That Thursday, she showed up at Arlington High, no entourage, no script. Just her, wrapped in a navy coat, hair pulled back, seated across from 30 students in a library that still smelled faintly of dry erase markers and carpet shampoo. "Why do people come at you so hard?" a girl asked, wasting no time. Jasmine smiled. "Because I don't speak in circles. That makes some people nervous." A boy in the back raised his hand. "Was that old guy at the summit your granddad? Or something?" She laughed. "No, he was my professor, and a tough one." "What did you learn from him?" Another student asked. Jasmine paused. That power isn't just about who holds the mic. It's about who holds the fact, especially when someone tries to twist them. And knowing when not to yell, even when every part of you wants to. The room went quiet, not out of awkwardness, but understanding. That evening, a local news anchor aired a segment titled, "Grace Under Fire," highlighting how Jasmine's silence in the face of smear campaigns had become its own statement. Subtle rebuke to the outrage economy. You don't have to show up to every fight just because you're invited. But not everyone respected her silence. And the next wave was already on its way. The next evening, as Jasmine left a community center on the east side of Grand Prairie, a car began tailing hers. 5 straight blocks. No signals, no passing. Just pressure. Marcus, her driver and former Army, cut into a grocery store lot without warning. The trailing car hesitated, then peeled off. They reported it. Nothing came of it. "You sure you don't want security on you?" Marcus asked quietly. Jasmine stared out the window. "They want me to react. That's half the game." He nodded. "And the other half? Making them regret thinking I wouldn't show up again." That weekend, the Seattle Standard published a stark op-ed. Crockett didn't flinch, and that's the real threat. It said what others wouldn't. Jasmine wasn't just representing herself anymore. She'd become a mirror. One that exposed how fragile the system felt when women like her didn't stay quiet, or furious, or easily dismissed. And she was none of those things. She was calm, prepared, present. But the more ground she gained, the more they tried to claw. At her foundation, a talk radio host sneered that she'd turned trauma into a brand. A cable news panel asked why a Texas congresswoman had any business shaping national curriculum. The answer was simple. She did the work. She showed up, even when showing up cost her. But silence has limits. And Jasmine knew now was the time to speak. On her terms, 3 days after the summit, she told her staff, "Clear the morning. No press, no calls, no meetings. Only one stop." She drove herself, quiet street in Fort Worth's north side, a few blocks from where it all began. Her heels echoed on the pavement as she approached the narrow brick building with ivy clinging to its face, faded green and older than memory. No cameras, no aides, just her. Inside, the old faculty lounge at the University of Houston's satellite campus still smelled like books and dust. A chipped mug of tea sat in front of Dr. Baylor, who was reading near the window. He looked up. "You found it?" "GPS." "Still works." Jasmine smiled. He gestured to the chair across from him. She sat, folding her coat neatly. "You've had quite a week," he said. "That's one way to put it." Silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, just full. "Why did you really come to the summit?" she asked. Baylor leaned back. "You ever walk into a room and just know something's off? But no one says it." She nodded. "I've been watching you. Watching them twist your intent, box you in with language they'd never use on someone else." He paused. "I knew Vance would try it live, on camera. So you came to back me up." "I came," he said slowly, "because I knew you wouldn't ask for help. And sometimes the strongest thing you can do is let yourself be defended." Jasmine's eyes met his. "I didn't want anyone to think I needed saving." "You weren't saved," Baylor replied. "You were witnessed." That hit different. She leaned in. "The late nights, the budgets, the edits, no one sees I've done all of that, but it wasn't until you spoke that people started listening." She exhaled. "Why is it like that?" Baylor let the quiet settle before answering. "Because this country doesn't reward the work. It rewards the spectacle till the work becomes too loud to ignore." She nodded slowly. "I wasn't sure I belonged in politics," she said. "Sometimes I still wonder if I'm built for it." "If it were easy," he said gently, "you wouldn't be necessary." They sat for a while longer. Light from the window cut across the table, spilling over Baylor's scattered notes. Finally, Jasmine reached into her bag and pulled out the original Education Equity Report, the one Baylor had brought to the summit. "I read it again," she said. "Some of it made me cringe." "That's how you know you've grown," he smiled. "You marked it up like a murder scene." "You were passionate," he said. "Passion without precision is messy, but it matters." She traced the highlighted lines. "Sometimes I wish I could go back and tell that girl to slow down." Baylor raised an eyebrow. "Why? That girl made this woman." They stood together as Jasmine turned to go. He said quietly, "They'll keep coming. Smarter, harsher." "I know," she said. "Then let me leave you with this. Speak when it matters. Rest when you must, and never let them define your worth." She looked back at him, soft but resolute. The silence had lasted long enough. It was time to speak, not just to a room, but to the country. And that Monday morning, Jasmine Crockett stepped behind a podium ready. At an education conference in Oklahoma City, there were no bright lights, no cable news crews, no dramatic stage setups, just rows of folding chairs filled by local teachers, PTA parents, and a few curious state reps. It wasn't a spectacle. It was a room full of people who cared enough to show up. Every seat was taken. Jasmine Crockett stood near the front in a burnt orange blouse beneath a gray blazer. Her hair was pulled back, and when she began to speak, her voice didn't quiver, didn't rise for effect. It was steady and rehearsed, but unmistakably intentional. "I wasn't planning to speak today," she began, "but sometimes silence sends the wrong message." The room grew quiet. No fidgeting. No phones. Some of you saw what happened at the summit, she continued. Some of you only saw the clips. And some probably saw the lies. So let me set the record straight. She paused not for drama, but to breathe. I didn't plan what happened. Dr. Baylor didn't come at my request. There was no script. No trending moment staged for the algorithm. Her eyes moved through the crowd. But I'm not sorry it happened. Soft murmurs moved across the room, the kind that came not from disagreement, but from a deep, collective exhale. I've spent most of my adult life fighting for equity in education. And if you think equity means making kids feel special, you've missed the point. Equity means making the rules fair before we start measuring outcomes. She lifted a single sheet of paper. This is a school lunch menu from East Texas. A parent sent it to me. One of the options is listed as no lunch, bring from home. She waited. What happens when home can't provide? Is that a math issue? Or is that a system problem? You could feel the shift. Eyes sharpened. Postures changed. I've had my words twisted. I've had networks crop my sentences. Bloggers dig through my law school papers like they're searching for some typo to discredit me. But here's what never gets mentioned. She tapped the paper, the kids. The ones who show up hungry. It's the ones punished for raising their voices when others are just warned. The ones whose names land their applications in the wrong pile. A teacher in the second row wiped her eyes. You don't have to like me. You don't have to agree with me. But know this, when I talk about equity, I'm not throwing buzzwords. I'm speaking from experience, from data, from hundreds of parents and teachers who call my office because no one else will return theirs. She stepped slightly back from the mic, and I'm going to keep speaking not because it's easy, not because it's safe, but because it's right. They stood not all at once, but fully, a long, sustained applause, not performative, just quiet gratitude. Afterward, people lined up by the stage. A teacher handed Jasmine a binder full of anonymous student essays on inequality. Another passed her a flash drive policy drafts they couldn't get through their own board. She took them all. Back in the car, her aide handed her the phone. You're being invited to the National Education Town Hall in D.C. You'll be on stage with 2 governors and the Secretary of Education. Jasmine looked out the window, then nodded. Let's do it. But I want time to meet the cafeteria staff first. Her team blinked. Cafeteria? She smiled. They know more about student need than half the folks writing policy. That evening, her Oklahoma speech was quoted in national outlets. No viral clash. No headline bait. Just clear, grounded truth. But for those still questioning her place, the most powerful message wasn't a speech. It came quietly. 3 weeks after the summit, Jasmine received a plain envelope with no return address. Inside, a single sheet of lined notebook paper, folded many times. The handwriting was neat, a little shaky. My name is Darnell. I'm 17. I didn't think people like you existed in Congress. My school has rules now about what teachers can say. One of them cried last. Month after a parent yelled at her. She said she's tired of pretending things are equal when they're not. I showed her your video. She said it made her feel braver. It made me feel like I could be more. I'm applying to Howard. I want to study education policy. Thank you for not staying quiet. Jasmine held the letter in both hands before gently refolding. She placed it in her desk drawer between a family photo and her old, worn copy of the Constitution from law school. It didn't go in a frame. It didn't need to. That letter was proof. Quiet proof. The kind that lives in inboxes, backpacks, faculty lounges unseen, but deeply felt. A week later, she returned to Capitol Hill. The House floor was noisy, the usual buzz of negotiations and debates. But Jasmine Crockett walked indifferent known. Because she had changed, but because the country had finally started to listen. They'd traded barbs and cable news interviews for weeks. But when Jasmine Crockett stood to speak during a subcommittee hearing on federal education grants, something rare happened. The room listened not just because of what had happened in Fort Worth, but because Crockett had done something most politicians don't. She took what should have been a trap and turned it into testimony. Not with insults, not with outrage, but with truth, and by allowing someone else, someone who had known her long before the spotlight, to speak on her behalf. The real lesson wasn't that she welcomed the debate. The lesson was this: we're not measured by how loud we shout in rooms full of microphones. We're measured by who's still willing to speak for us when we're not in the room. And on that day in Fort Worth, Jasmine Crockett didn't just go viral. She gained something deeper: trust, legitimacy, and the kind of quiet momentum that only comes from being underestimated and then proving everyone wrong. Dr. Baylor never gave another public comment after that. He returned to his office, his books, his lectures. But his words lingered longer than the applause, longer than the headlines. In the weeks that followed, lawmakers began citing Crockett's proposals more frequently. School board leaders reached out for her team's data. And then something unexpected happened: shift. Not just in public perception, but in participation. Students like Darnell began emailing her office. Teachers who'd stopped speaking up in staff meetings began again. One story didn't change the world, but it sparked dozens more. That's how change begins. Not with spectacle, not with drama, but with clarity, the courage to stand your ground when someone powerful tries to shake it. As for Vice President Vance, he said little after the summit. He never addressed Dr. Baylor directly. His team quietly removed the summit clip from their website. And when asked later by reporters if he regretted how he handled it, he simply replied, "We disagree on the facts. That's all." But by then, the country had already decided, because sometimes facts are just numbers. Other times, they're a story: a woman who never forgot where she came from, who kept the receipts, and let someone else remind the world just how long she'd been doing the work. So if you're watching this wondering whether what you do matters, whether your quiet work, your late nights, your invisible truth has weight, let this be your answer. It does. And when the moment comes when someone else tries to tell your story for you, make sure the people who know your real work are in the room. That's the difference between being a headline and becoming a legacy. If this story moved, you share it. Speak up when it's hard. Stand with someone when the world tries to shrink them. And never let a title in front of someone's name silence you. Subscribe for more stories that remind us what courage really looks like.